They cast me out of my father's empire. So I returned and took everything. The brushed steel doors of the elevator slid shut, encasing the three of us in a suffocating silence. The air was thick with unsaid things, a tension so palpable it felt like a fourth passenger. Julian, my stepbrother, vibrated with barely contained rage, his reflection a sharp, angry portrait in the polished wall. Beside him, our stepmother, Eleonora, stood like a marble statue, her composure flawless except for the tiny rhythmic tap of her fingernail against her designer handbag. A nervous habit. Good. She was rattled. I remained perfectly still, my thoughts drifting back to my father, Marcus Thorne. He'd warned me before the end, his voice weak, but his eyes sharp. Beware the wolves in sheep's clothing, Arya. They smile brightest right before they bite. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened onto the top floor. The boardroom, my father's boardroom, 12 pairs of eyes, a veritable gallery of corporate predators, swiveled in our direction. They were all Eleonora's people, loyalists and sycophants who owed their lavish lifestyles to her. Their faces, a mixture of contempt and annoyance, made it clear I was an unwelcome stain on their expensive mahogany world. Eleonora glided forward, her voice a silken threat. Gentlemen, my apologies for the interruption. This is, of course, a closed meeting. Julian smirked, stepping forward as her attack dog. Security has been called, he announced to the room, though his eyes were locked on me. They will escort this disruption out. But I didn't look at him. I didn't even look at Eleonora. My gaze was fixed on the single empty chair at the head of the long, imposing table. My father's chair. With a calm that seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst, I walked toward it. Each step was deliberate, a challenge to the entire power structure they had so carefully built. I didn't sit, not yet. I simply placed my hand on the back of the leather chair. Actually, I said, my voice cutting through the tense boardroom quiet, I believe the largest shareholder has a right to stay. A wave of stunned silence rippled across the room. It was followed by a short, ugly bark of laughter from a portly man at the far end, one of Eleonora's oldest cronies. The largest shareholder, he sneered his disdain, dripping from every word. Little girl, are you dreaming? I didn't answer him. There was no need. Instead, I let my eyes drift to the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I simply waited. They thought this was my play. They had no idea I was just the opening act. Right on cue, the heavy doors swung open. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stood in the doorway, holding a leather briefcase. He met my gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Mrs. Sterling? He began, his voice calm and clear. I believe this documentation will clarify everything. Mr. Albright strode forward and placed the thick, leather-bound folder on the mahogany table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to silence the room. Julian, however, couldn't resist a final jab. He laughed a short, ugly sound. What's this, Albright? A few pieces of paper? Is this supposed to be your big dramatic trick, Arya? I said nothing. I just watched Eleonora. More cunning than her son, she knew a real threat when she saw one. Her manicured fingers reached out and hesitantly opened the folder. She scanned the first page, and then the second. The smug, condescending smile didn't just fade. It seemed to crack and fall from her face, leaving behind a mask of cold, stark shock. That's when Mr. Albright dropped the bomb. His voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical recitation of facts that made the words all the more devastating. Over the past 5 years, he announced to the stunned room, through a carefully orchestrated network of shell companies and third-party proxy holdings, my client, Miss Arya Thorne, has systematically acquired a controlling interest in this company. As of 9 a.m. this morning, all holdings were consolidated under a single parent entity. She now controls 75% of all voting shares in Sterling Legacy Incorporated. The truth once revealed was not silent. It was an explosion. A wave of panicked whispers and gasps swept through the boardroom. The hostile takeover wasn't just a threat, it was a completed fact. Julian's face turned a shade of crimson I'd never seen before. Impossible! He roared, slamming his fist on the table so hard the crystal water glasses rattled. We would have known every single major share transaction requires the board's approval. This is a lie. I finally allowed myself a small smile. It felt cold on my lips. Board approval is only required for transactions over a certain percentage, Julian, I said softly, enjoying the way every board member flinched. A threshold you yourselves set. All one has to do is stay under it, dozens and dozens of times. I let the implication hang in the air before I delivered the final fatal blow. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on Eleonora's. It's truly amazing what one can do with the right corporate structures, especially when they are structures that you yourself created for other purposes. Tell me, Eleonora, does the name Nightingale Holdings ring a bell? It was a direct hit, but it wasn't just Eleonora who reacted. At the far end of the table, the same portly director who had laughed at me just moments ago went completely white. He physically recoiled, his eyes wide with terror. He was the traitor, or rather, he was the first domino. He had helped Eleonora set up that shell company to siphon funds, and now he knew that I knew. They all knew. I had turned their own dirty secrets against them. Unable to grasp the strategic masterstroke, Julian fell back on raw fury. "This is my father's company," he bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. "You have no right." I stood up slowly, my voice cutting through his tantrum like a shard of ice. "You're wrong. This isn't about rights." I paused, looking at each of their terrified faces. "This is my father's justice." My declaration of justice hung in the air, thick and heavy. But I didn't give them a moment to recover. Leaving them to stew in their shock, I turned my back on the board and walked calmly to the head of the table where the presentation console sat. With a few taps on my phone, I wirelessly connected to the massive 80-inch screen that dominated the wall. The Sterling Legacy logo vanished, replaced by a dizzying web of spreadsheets and bank statements. The evidence of fraud. Ownership is one thing, I began, my voice amplified slightly by the room's speakers. But management is another. Let's review your performance, shall we? I clicked through the slides. Offshore accounts in the Caymans. Mysterious consulting fees paid to shell companies owned by Eleonora's brother. Millions siphoned away from shareholder value. The board members who had been sneering just minutes before were now desperately avoiding eye contact with me, with Eleonora, with each other. "But this is just money," I said, flicking to the final image. It was a document, the share transfer agreement, that had sealed my father's early retirement. I zoomed in on the signature line. Marcus Thorne. Except it wasn't quite right. It was shaky, forced. The work of a forger. "Let's talk about this, Eleonora. Let's talk about these forged signatures. Let's talk about how you really pushed my father out." Julian found his voice a desperate cracking shout. "That's a lie. Everything was legal. He signed those papers." I ignored him completely. My focus was on Eleonora, whose perfectly composed facade was crumbling into dust. Slowly, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the old, unassuming fountain pen. The one from the lobby, the one my father had given me. My father was a meticulous man, I said, holding it up for them all to see. He trusted no one. Especially not after you entered his life, Eleonora. So he developed a habit. He recorded important conversations. He said it helped him remember the exact words people used. I clicked the top of the pen. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. And then the room's speakers crackled. A voice filled the air. A ghost's voice. It was my father, weaker than they remembered, but it was him. "This is blackmail, Eleonora," his recorded voice pleaded. Then came her reply, sharp and cold. "Call it whatever you like, Marcus. The board is on my side. Sign the papers and hand control to Julian. Or you will face consequences you cannot possibly imagine. I will destroy you. I will destroy everything you love." The recording clicked off, plunging the room into a deafening silence. That was it. The final undeniable proof. The direct threat. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about a life. Eleonora made a sound, a choked, guttural sob. She didn't sink into her chair. She collapsed into it, her body folding, as if her bones had turned to liquid. Her carefully constructed world hadn't just cracked. It had been utterly annihilated by the voice of the man she had destroyed. As her broken sobs filled the void, the boardroom doors swung open for a third and final time. 2 stern-faced agents in dark suits stepped inside. Justice had arrived. The chaos that followed was swift and brutally efficient. As the 2 FBI agents moved into the room, Julian, snapping out of his stupor, made a desperate lunge for the door. But my own security team flanking the entrance simply stepped in his way. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by a terrified pleading boy who was quickly and quietly escorted out. Eleonora didn't fight. She didn't even seem to be there anymore. A ghost in a designer suit, she was gently guided from her chair, her vacant eyes staring at nothing as the agents led her away, her broken sobs the only sound she made. The FBI arrest was the final clean cut, severing the rot from the company. Once they were gone, I turned to the remaining members of the board. They looked like frightened animals, their faces pale and slick with sweat. I felt no pity. None. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You have an ultimatum. I will accept your signed resignations on my desk within the next 24 hours. Your only other option is to take whatever evidence of cooperation you might have directly to the federal investigators who are currently setting up in the lobby." I let the words hang in the air. Choose wisely. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The Sterling scandal was on every news channel, a spectacular bonfire of greed and corruption. But while the world watched the old empire burn, I was busy rebuilding from the ashes. The first most visible change was the name. The polished silver letters spelling out Sterling Legacy Inc. were taken down from the front of the building, replaced by a new name forged in clean modern steel, Thorn Dynamics. One evening, sitting alone in my father's office, my Office Now and email popped up on my screen. The sender was an encrypted, untraceable address. The message was short, but it meant everything. "He always knew you had it in you. Marcus would be so proud." DC David Chen, the disgraced former CFO, the secret ally Eleonora had cast out years ago, the brilliant mind who had helped me navigate the financial maze to enact my plan. A faint smile touched my lips. My victory wasn't mine alone. The next morning I stood before every employee of the company, from the executive floor to the mailroom, all gathered in the main auditorium. "For too long this company has been driven by greed," I began, my voice clear and steady. "Today, that ends. Today we return to the principles on which my father, Marcus Thorne, built this company: integrity, innovation, and respect." I laid out the new vision: improved employee benefits, a transparent profit-sharing program that made everyone a true stakeholder, and a renewed commitment to ethical business practices. And finally, I announced we are establishing the Marcus Thorne Foundation for Corporate Ethics to ensure that no other company has to suffer what this one did. A moment of silence passed. Then a single person began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the hesitant applause grew into a thunderous rolling ovation that washed over me, a wave of hope cleansing the sins of the past. Months passed. The city lights of the skyline glittered outside the panoramic window of my office, a constant twinkling reminder of the new reality. Thorn Dynamics wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, a beacon of the corporate ethics we championed. The storm had passed, and in its wake there was a quiet, steady peace. My phone buzzed on the polished desk. A text from Mr. Albright. FYI. Eleanor confessed to first-degree murder, pleading guilty and testifying against Julian in exchange for a reduced sentence. They are, as you predicted, destroying each other. I read the words feeling nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even a flicker of the cold fire that had driven me for so long. The need for revenge had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner, something better. With a simple swipe of my thumb, I deleted the message and the last vestiges of their venom from my life. Their future was a cage of their own making. It had nothing to do with mine. I opened the top drawer of my father's desk and pulled out an old, faded photograph. It was of the two of us at my college graduation, years before Eleonora and Julian had entered our lives, our smiles wide and genuine. A different lifetime. I remembered Julian's sneering voice in the lobby that day, mocking me that the board meeting was for shareholders only. He never imagined that his unwanted stepsister would end up owning not just the shares, but the entire game. But that wasn't the victory. The true justice wasn't in taking back what was mine. It was in the rebuilding. It was in forging a lasting legacy from the ashes of what they had so ruthlessly destroyed.